Well, you know, I've said it before that one way, my favorite way to read the Bible, is to hear it as one big love story between God and humanity. A lot of people I know, though, have come to see the Bible as a big, heavy rule book, a policy manual, a kind of moral doorstop, or maybe just a long and scolding sermon to make us feel bad about everything. And the way this passage from Matthew ends is actually kind of like that. I was laughing at our Thursday Bible study when I heard this part of Matthew 13 read aloud, because it really hit me how the dialogue here between Jesus and his disciples unfolds. Today's section, as Melanie told the kids, is a very rich one, a series of parables about the kingdom of heaven with some interesting one-liners in it, some good images. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast. The kingdom of heaven is like a hidden treasure. These metaphors are so rich with meaning. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he goes and sells all that he has to obtain it. But then it takes this kind of uncomfortable turn. Again, Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like a net. So far, so good. A net that is thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down, and put into baskets the good ones and threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all this? And they answered, yes. Yes, sir. No more questions. We do not wish to be thrown into the fire like stinking, rotted fish. Nope, no further questions. One of the things I loved about these three lectionary readings today together is that it gives us a good example of texts where the Hebrew scripture story of Jacob's love for Rachel here in Genesis 29, and this poem really from the Apostle Paul, this letter about the love of Jesus from this, for us in this world. Both of these texts are practically overflowing with images of the good news of God's love for us. And I'll talk about them in a minute. But this passage from Jesus, it's one of those where if God is still speaking, if we're hearing Jesus' voice in this, it might make us kind of want to go and hide under the bed. I was just, though, this morning fixing my cereal for breakfast and still kind of contemplating this text and what I had planned to say, and I was sorting my strawberries. They were a little bit past their prime. Had to kind of separate the good ones from the bad, and a few of them were kind of in between, kind of in the middle. So I cut away the bad parts and salvaged what I could. Didn't tell John that, but anyway, I still had my bowl of cereal, but I started to think about fish. Fish are not like that, are they? When fish go bad, they go really bad. I have this friend who, like many of you, travels a lot for work. She was a sports writer, and one of the times she left on a trip down in North Carolina, she parked at long-term parking in the summertime. She had gotten on her plane, and when she got back, 10 days later, she discovered that the little bag of shrimp that she had purchased had fallen out of, the floppy plastic grocery bag as they do when they fall over in your car and had rolled under the driver's seat. You can imagine how delicious her car smelled after that. No amount of cleaning could get it out. It was totaled, really, without ever leaving the parking lot. And this is the warning that Jesus has to us. Not such good news unless you start to think about Jesus' intention. We know he cares for us, so this must be a kind of tough love he wants to share. Maybe it's a good thing, like a parent might do, to offer that kind of dire warning that we really can go so far awry that we might have a very difficult time finding our way out of the messes we make for ourselves. He reminds us of that thing that too many people, I think, discover only at the very end of their lives, and that is to really treasure the love that we have in our lives while we have it. Never, ever take holy love for granted. You remember that famous line that Jack Palance has in that movie City Slickers? Did you all remember that movie? It was back in 1991. We were all quoting his line, I remember back then, when the movie came out. It had this wonderful 30 seconds of gospel truth about the meaning of life, Old West style. The tough old cowboy Jack says to the city slicker Billy Crystal, he says, "Do you know what the secret of life is? This." And he holds up one finger. And of course, Billy Crystal goes, "What, your finger?" And he says, "No. This one thing, just one thing. You stick to that, and everything else don't mean anything." "That's great," Billy says, "but what's the one thing?" And Jack says, "That's what you have to figure out." And Billy, by the end of the movie, not to ruin it for you, he figures out that his life is not about his high-powered career, as he had thought, but about the precious love of his wife and kids. He finds that his home life and not his job is the pearl without price that he most needs to treasure, because that's where he finds the source of his holy love. And the good news for us is that you don't have to be married with children to find it. By finding so many ways to talk about the kingdom of heaven in this passage, Jesus, we know, is leading us to think more about the big love of God, the love that's bigger than any romantic love of a great life partner or any single human family. He's talking about God's endless love, love eternal and imperishable, the holy love that God pours out for us, whether we deserve it or not, both in this life and in the next. And this is not love that we have to travel very far to find, as I said last week. God's holy love for us is as near to us as our next breath. And the mystery of mysteries is, it is never perhaps more near to us than in our very last breath. When all else in our life is past and done, if we have the privilege of being able to look back upon our lives and sort out the good from the bad in our final moments, this truth from Jesus has to remain with us. It's not a threat, but a promise that as beautiful and wonderful as this life can be, our whole earthly life may just be seen as a first act of God's whole life for us, a warm-up for life to come. But here's the thing, during our earthly lives, it can be very hard to cherish and treasure those moments of sparkling love that we find, especially when things aren't going as well as possible. It can be very hard to be patient with God with God's timing, God's wisdom, God's decisions. And that's the real challenge. How do we stay focused on that one thing that Jesus says is most important, most to be treasured, the gift of holy love of God for the world? How can we accept the invitation to be in loving relationship with the God who made us when things aren't turning out exactly the way we had hoped they would go? And that's where poor Jacob comes in his story. You remember his struggle. From last week, we learned how he made this terrible mistake by cheating his blind father, tricking his blind father, to give him his older brother's blessing. He's trying to win an inheritance that was not his to have. So he has to go on the run for his life from his home in Beersheba in the southernmost pasture lands of Judah to find protection at his mother's brother's home way up north in Haran, 450 miles away. It's a long walk in southeastern Turkey. It's a little farther than our senior high youth will be going next week on their mission trip. It'd be a long walk. They'd have to kind of get to Orland, Maine, and then go a few, maybe 70 more miles north to the Canadian border to make that journey. So he had already gone a long way. When he gets there, falls in love with Rachel and learns that he has to work for 7 years to earn her hand in marriage. But young Jacob is deeply in love, infatuated at least with her beauty, and he considers her well worth the price. So he does his time on the farm. He marries her. And then in the morning after his wedding, he finds out that he has been tricked. The trickster has been tricked. He's been swindled out of the future that he believed himself entitled to. He must have been furious, the Bible doesn't say. He ends up with the older sister, the one whom our Bible translation, charitably enough, says had lovely eyes. Other translations of the Hebrew have different words. Some say that her eyes were interesting. Others that her eyes were unusual. You just never know whether this is like Liz Taylor, beautiful, unusual lavender eyes, or something a little more frightening. In any case, traditionally, the rabbis' teaching on this leave us to assume that at the very least, she was not the first choice of a young man with not much more on his mind than his wedding night. He didn't have enough life experience or wisdom yet to know that a good wife may have more to offer a man than youthful beauty. But for those who know the whole story, we realize that God had the big picture in mind. As was promised to his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham, Jacob was to become the father of a great nation. His name, in previews of coming attractions, come back next week for that story, his name next week will be changed to Israel. His 12 sons came from these 2 wives. Leah with 6, Rachel with 2, and then their 2 slaves, Bilhah and Zilpah, each with 2 sons. This is a great text, by the way, to quote to anyone who starts, kind of ranting at you about the wonderful family values in the Bible, that demand that marriage always, always, always must be between one man and one woman, who love to accuse us in open and affirming churches like ours of slipping from traditional biblical morality. You can just say to them, let's all turn to Genesis 29, shall we? Polygamy, slavery, murdering brothers. It was all wonderful. We should go back to those good old days. Anyway, the point here is that nothing could separate Jacob from the love of God for him. Not his greed, not his dishonesty, not his blatant disrespect for his father. And not even this cruel trick played upon him at his wedding, when the tables are turned on him and he is the one who is deceived in the dark. This Jacob has to stay around to learn patience as he works another whole 7 years to win the hand of his beloved Rachel. But what I love, what comes many chapters later, is that at the end of Jacob's life, when he asks his sons to bury him, he doesn't ask to be buried on the roadside with Rachel, where she had died in childbirth, young, with her son Benjamin. He asks to be buried at the side of the wife of his youth, Leah, the one with the nice eyes. We have to wonder if, after all of those years, he didn't come to learn something about holy love, after all, something that perhaps the father Laban, with his age and wisdom, knew about his daughter Leah. If the eyes are the window of the soul, perhaps a loving father could see something with his heart that a young man could not. And when we get to the end of our lives, as Jesus says, we get this perspective. We get to look back and see with something not quite, but approaching God's perspective. We can see the holy love that we maybe should have treasured all along. It is love, as Paul says, that can never be overcome by earthly hardship or distress or persecution or famine. It is the pearl of great price that we can actually begin to treasure today. Jesus offers his hand to us every day. In the church, we are said to be, after all, the holy bride of Christ. Let us rejoice that we have been called his beloved, the ones he will love and cherish till the end of time. Thanks be to God for this good news. Amen.